And I believe we're live. So, welcome everyone as you're signing in. If you've been here before and you come early, then you know that it takes me a minute or two to get Facebook Live working. So, because we can't actually start that until we're live with everything else. And that's fine because that gives everybody a couple of minutes to join and say hi. It looks like it's working. It's been pretty good. The first couple of weeks we started this, Facebook Live and Zoom were a little bit hit and miss, the connection. I think it was just overwhelmed.
Now, Greg, should I hop in on the Facebook Live too so I can see the chat, like the
Well,
questions?
we encourage people to jump on the Zoom, so I don't think we'll
Okay.
get too many.
Oh, they'll post
I'll,
it in the Zoom itself. Okay, perfect.
yeah, that's the plan.
Awesome.
So welcome everyone. Where Facebook Live seems to be spinning up. We'll see how that goes. So we're going to be talking today about Canadian immigration law. And Joshua's on standby there. You heard him a minute ago and probably saw him when he flashed up there. Um, he's an immigration lawyer and the CEO of Visto, and I'm sure you'll be talking us a little bit about both of those roles in a couple of minutes. But I wanted to fill everybody in on some of the stuff that's coming up. So on Thursday, April 30th, or tomorrow, I'm going to be presenting on building $1 million pitch deck. I presented this a few times before, and I help startups take their deck from just average to outstanding, and understanding the mind of the investor and what they really have to, the information they really have to get across. So we're going to talk about that tomorrow. We're taking Friday off, but we're back Monday with Emily O'Brien. She's an Instagram personality and an entrepreneur, and she's the founder of Comeback Snacks. Used to be Cons and Kernels. She will be here at noon on Monday, and we're going to be talking about Instagram marketing. Monday evening, we're lucky to have the guys from Galleon CPA back talking about how to build a financial forecast. So financial forecast is important for everything. If you're doing for VCs, for doing for valuations, you're talking about getting bank loans or just projections from a monetary point of view for business planning. And a lot of people have questions around that. So we're going to be going through that with Galleon, and so bring your questions. We have lots of stuff upcoming. Idea validation workshop, or our courses are coming back online. We're doing that on Tuesday next week. So if you're interested in that, sign up there. The growth hacking workshop is on Thursday next week. It's a 3-hour workshop. You get over 100 tips and tricks and growth hack techniques. And on May 11th, Galleon's back. So we talked about financial forecasting. Now we're going to talk about how you support your valuation. So when you're going to go get investment, how much you get and how much you have to give up really depends on your valuation. So when you're talking to investors, angel investors, VCs, there's always a negotiation back and forth about what your company's actually worth, and then how much my investment is worth and what you're going to give me as a return. So let's talk about how you defend that, and when you come up with a number in your head and not get talked down too much by investors and whatnot. And on May 12th, it's the SEO crash course. It's another 3-hour crash course where we take the very complex concepts of SEO so that anybody can understand them and start ranking on Google and driving the right traffic immediately. So if you want to learn that kind of stuff, join us. All our past videos and future videos are on listed at TorontoStarts.com. So go check it out, and check out our How to Start a Business in Ontario guide. We've got over 200 VCs. We've got angel investors. We got all the incubators, accelerators. We have so much information there. Go check it out. We're adding stuff all the time. If you see something that we're missing, feel free to fill in the form there, and so we'll add it. And I'd like to say hi to Joshua. How you doing, Joshua?
I'm doing well, Craig. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
So there's been a lot of stuff going on with COVID. How are you coping?
I'm coping fine. I mean, I'm an introvert who spent the majority of the last 3 years working from home. So while I do miss the office, I feel like I'm weathering the storm pretty well.
When you say you spent the last few years working from home, now that you're kind of semi forced to work from home, have your habits changed?
Um, Not really. I mean, what's always worked well for me during periods of working from home is having good routines in place. It's when you don't have routines that you start sleeping in more, you start pushing the boundaries, and this, that, and the other. So I've been pretty good at kind of sticking to a routine, trying to stay productive. I feel like the last few years have prepped me well for working from home. So so far so good.
Yeah, I'm used to working from home because I usually only go to Toronto. People don't know, maybe not know this, but I live in Burlington, and all my events and in-person stuff happens in Toronto, or had used to happen in Toronto. So I would only go in on those days where I had events, and I would pack those days with meetings. And so 3 4 days a week, I'm 3 days a week I'm working from home. But my routine included going to Starbucks. I'd get out and go for a bike ride, 10 15K, and then go to Starbucks and work out of there for 2 hours. And then when I go stir crazy, ride somewhere else. So I haven't had that go somewhere else situation that I can do when I'm kind of, that's been driving me a little crazy. But like I said beforehand, I've ordered my bike parts, so all that's going to be going. So beside all of that, what are we talking about today?
Yeah, so we're going to talk about, I mean, the focus will be on immigration. There's a lot that's happened, as you can imagine, in the last month and a half. The Immigration Canada IRCC has actually done a pretty good job of keeping everyone posted, but there's a whole lot of updates, right? So instead of people having to sift through their pretty big website, what I've done is kind of condensed what I think the key takeaways are in terms of travel and what employees that might be here on a temporary permit or permanent residency might want to know, and what companies might want to know if they have if they're employing or thinking of employing foreign workers as well.
And we definitely want to, we've kept the presentation fairly short today because we want to get to all your questions. So start listing them now in the Q&A section. We've got a couple there already. We'll get to those. We're going to let you do your presentation before we start getting to all the questions. But we definitely want people to start putting their questions in now because we'll start answering them as we go and at the end, and we'll have lots of time. So if you're thinking about it, put them in now. We'll guarantee to answer them then. So without further ado, why don't we pull up your presentation, and hopefully one of your early slides is telling us a little bit about you and about Visto.
Absolutely. Can you guys see the first slide over here?
Yes, it does. Looks great.
Awesome. So yeah, I'll jump into it. As Greg said, I kept it relatively short. I'll probably talk for about 10 15 minutes, as is usually the case with immigration. There's a lot of people in a lot of different scenarios. So I'm happy to stick around for Q&A as well. So we're going to talk about Canadian immigration law for businesses and employees. My name is Josh, and I'll get into a quick introduction about myself in just a second. Really quickly, the agenda. So I'll talk quickly about who am I, gives you some perspective and some of my experiences. I'm going to talk about travel. So what are the current travel restrictions put in place? This is important not only for immigrants or potential immigrants, but even for Canadian citizens and permanent residents, because there are some interesting kind of rules in effect right now. I'm going to talk from the perspective of an employee, whether that be someone already in Canada or maybe you're interested in coming to Canada from abroad, kind of what you might need or want to know, as well as for companies, right? Maybe you have temporary foreign workers that are working for you right now within the country. Maybe you're in the midst of sponsoring some, maybe you're thinking about sponsoring some and you kind of want to know whether that's even a good idea or not. So we'll talk about that too. Lastly, of course, Q&A. And as Craig said, feel free to type in your questions now. We'll scroll up as high as we have to after the presentation to get to all of them. So really quickly, who am I? My name is Josh. I'm actually Ottawa born and raised. I relocated to Toronto about 2.5 years ago. I did my BCom at Carleton at home in Ottawa. I then did my law degree at Western University, which is in London, Ontario. I'm a Canadian immigration lawyer. I spent the majority of the last 3 years doing corporate immigration work, so primarily working with startups, helping them sponsor engineers, developers, data scientists, mostly tech workers from around the world. And I'm more recently, excuse me, the CEO at Visto.ai. We're building out a free portal, which actually we just launched the newest version on Monday, which helps international students and skilled workers navigate the Canadian immigration process. I'll tell you a little bit more about that at the end. But for right now, let's get into the fun stuff. Really quick disclaimer. I kind of just have to do this in general. General information purposes only is what the presentation is for. It doesn't create any lawyer-client relationship or any of that stuff. However, I do think it'll be really helpful, and I'm happy to provide as much insight as I can. So let's jump into it really quickly. The current state. I don't really have to say this, but I'll repeat it anyways. These are unprecedented times in general, as well as from an immigration standpoint, right? So what's happening is there are constant updates coming out almost on a weekly basis from Immigration Canada. And while some processes have actually stayed relatively the same, mostly around work permits, and I'll get into more detail on that, some have not been the same whatsoever. So for example, study permits are no longer being processed right now. PR invites are pretty much only going out to people from within the country. So there's a lot that has not changed, a lot that has changed. Hopefully what I can do is help clarify as much of that as possible. Now, due to this, what I started doing is I go live weekly every Friday afternoon with a fellow immigration lawyer. And every week we update what we call the special measures Google Doc. So special measures being what immigration calls its, new rules that come into effect due to COVID. And so what I'll do is actually, Greg, what I can do is send you the link, or I can even share it in the chat myself. It's a Google Doc that I update every week with what you need to know about travel, being an employee, being a company. A lot of the stuff that I'm covering here is exactly covered there. So I'll link to that at the end of the description or at the end of the presentation. I can also, Greg, I can send you a copy of the deck as well, and you could circulate that too.
Fantastic. Thanks.
Awesome. So let's get into it. Let's talk about travel. Obviously, super important given the circumstances. The reality is actually right now that only certain people can enter Canada, right? So there's no free flow travel right now. I'm not going to go through the whole list because it's actually in the special measures document I talked about. But when Canada put in its new order on travel, it includes primarily Canadian citizens, PRs, family members, stuff like that, right? Or people that are allowed to enter Canada. What they did as well is created an exemption list. So from the order itself, what Canada's told us, only a certain amount of people can enter from Canada, PRs, citizens, primary, people falling under the Indian Act, stuff like that. And then they also have a list of exemptions. So we will exempt that restriction to the following people, such as TFWs, so temporary foreign workers. These are individuals that have work permits. So whether you have one or you're applying for one, Canada has deemed temporary foreign workers to be essential and can still travel into the country. Students or PRs who are approved before March 18th. So if you got a study permit before March 18th, if you were approved for PR before March 18th, you're still allowed to travel into Canada. If they were after the fact, you're not allowed to travel into Canada. As well as immediate family of citizens and PRs. So immediate family meaning spouses, dependent children, parents, dependent children of dependent children, and stuff like that. Now, this is not an exhaustive list. There are other exemptions. They're all listed in the special measures doc because if I went through the whole list, it would take up the whole hour and there would be no Q&As. But what's most important is that number one, if you are thinking of traveling to Canada, that you are either allowed to or you're on that exemption list. Number two, to keep in mind, is what's required on landing. So whether you are a Canadian citizen, a PR, on the exemption list, if you're trying to come to Canada, there are stringent requirements on doing so. So first of all, even with regards to airlines, getting on the plane, airlines are now doing health checks and making sure that you fall under the exemption list before they even let you on the airplane. When you land, you have to clear customs, right? Which is, that's the organization is called the CBSA. They run customs and they're going to do a health check as well to see if you have any symptoms. Either way, whether you do or you don't, and if you do have symptoms, they do have the right to actually turn you away. You have to have a plan in place for a mandatory 14-day quarantine. Again, this doesn't matter what your status is. You're a citizen, you're a PR, you're a TFW, et cetera, et cetera. If you're landing in Canada from outside the country, you need a plan in place for a 14-day quarantine. This includes how you're going to travel, right, to your destination, where you're going to stay for the 14 days, how you're going to get food for 14 days, right? Who's going to take after you for 14 days? And if the CBSA is not convinced you have a legitimate plan, they do have the right to turn you around. So for you, your family, your friends, anybody considering returning to or coming to Canada, make sure you have a plan in place for that 14-day quarantine. All right. Let's talk about employees. And again, this can be people currently in Canada that are foreign employees or people considering it, because as I mentioned, temporary foreign workers are on the exemption list from travel. So first and foremost, TFWs, temporary foreign workers. What a TFW basically is somebody who holds a work permit. So if you have a work permit, you are exempt from the travel ban, and they're allowing you to travel in and out of Canada and start working in Canada. What Immigration Canada has done is they're granting extensions for most applications, whether it be a work permit or PR, basically saying if you have to gather certain documents and that is being delayed due to COVID. So for example, maybe you need a reference letter, maybe you need to give your biometrics, maybe you need to get a medical exam. Most of those things are either unavailable or being delayed right now. So what Immigration Canada is saying is we will give you added time. We will not reject immigration applications strictly due to the fact that you could not submit a certain document due to COVID, right? So you may be in the middle of a PR application, or maybe you've been requested to give biometrics. You don't have to stress over an application being rejected strictly due to certain documents. So IRCC, Immigration Canada, has been fairly flexible in that regard. Some applications are still being processed. So that's probably the first question I usually get, right? Is Immigration Canada still operating? They are still processing work permit applications. They are not processing study permit applications, and we will, update the Google Doc as these things change. They are still inviting PR candidates, permanent resident candidates from within Canada to apply. So those who might be interested in PR, you may have heard of the process called Express Entry. This is the PR application for skilled workers. You can do it all online. There are a few programs under Express Entry. One of them is for individuals with Canadian work experience that are already in Canada. Canada right now is only inviting those through the Canadian experience class to apply for PR right now. So if you're outside of the country trying to apply for PR, you may not be getting an invite to apply for a while due to the circumstances. I can't say for how long, might be a month, might be 4, we don't really know, but we'll be updating the Google Doc when we do get news on that. Give yourself lots of time. This applies to anything immigration related. This probably applies to anything across the globe related right now, right? Everything is going to take longer. Gathering your documents, some will take you longer. Having your application processed will take longer, right? So Immigration Canada has said, you can check our average processing times on our website, but expect more delays, right? So you can go on IRCC, you can check what the average processing time is for any type of application, but I would add 30 to 50% onto that estimated time because everything's moving a lot slower right now. Okay, so let's talk about companies. If you're an employer in Canada, maybe you have some TFWs on staff, maybe you're in the process of sponsoring, maybe you're thinking about sponsoring. What's most important is work permits are still being processed, right? So there are, for example, especially in tech, a lot of companies, they still need engineers, they still need developers, et cetera, et cetera. They're still willing to sponsor them and apply for the work permits. They are still being processed. As I just mentioned, there are delays in processing. So definitely bake those delays into your expectations for you and your employee as well. LMIAs are extended from 6 to 9 months in terms of validity. What an LMIA is basically, if you're a company trying to sponsor a foreign worker, in most cases, the company first has to apply for an LMIA, a labor market impact assessment. Once approved, you then have normally 6 months for the worker to submit their work permit application. The ESDC has extended that to 9 months, so they're giving you more time to kind of find the right worker and have them actually collect their documents and submit the application. And the other thing is, part of the LMIA approval is a 12-month audit. Every 12 months, they will audit the company, make sure you're abiding by the terms of the LMIA. The ESDC has just canceled them for now, right? So a lot of LMIAs require, you're meeting certain, you're creating new jobs, you're guaranteeing certain revenue, you're hiring co-op students, et cetera, et cetera. All of those things are now harder than ever for companies to do. So the ESDC has just said, we're going to cancel the audits for now. Companies, we understand you're going through the struggle. Don't worry about that for the time being. So that's good news for companies that have positive LMIAs. There are also stringent requirements to support the quarantine for incoming employees, right? So in my previous slide, I mentioned the mandatory 14-day quarantine for anybody coming into the country. There are stringent requirements so that employers are supporting those employees in that endeavor, right? You cannot ask your employee to come to work within 14 days. In fact, you can't really ask them to work for the first 14 days, but you do have to pay them. And so there's a list of requirements. We link to it in the Google Doc. I highly recommend, if you have new TFWs coming into the country anytime soon, that you review those requirements because they're very important. So that's pretty much it for companies. Otherwise, it's relatively straightforward and does mostly have to do with the individual. Overall, what I want to say is Immigration Canada is still open for business for certain areas, right? The work permits, PRs from within the country, not for study permits. Visitor visas will really only be for those that are extending from within the country, or if you have to travel for essential reasons, right? You can't get a visitor visa to just come casually check out Canada right now. In fact, you won't even be allowed on the plane if that's the purpose. Plan far in advance. So this applies to everybody, right? If you need to renew an application, if you need to submit an application, if you want to sponsor a foreign worker, anything, plan ahead, expect delays, right? The biggest issues I've ever had when dealing with clients is when they come to me and they say, I have a month left on my permit. What can we do? What opens up way more doors is if 4, 5, 6 months ahead of any expiries, you say, okay, it's time to sit down and decide what the next step is so we can start preparing and submitting the application. And lastly, I mean, I'm here to help. So I actually am primarily working on Visto right now, but I still do operate my practice. I do some consulting. And so speak to me, speak to another professional. These are now more confusing times than normal, right? So dealing with immigration can be confusing to start. And this just adds a whole other layer on top, right? As most areas are seeing right now. So rely on trustworthy sources. Lastly, the special measures doc. So again, I'm going to link to it. As soon as I end this kind of presentation, I can put the link in the chat so that everybody has it. I just don't want to break out of the slide deck right now. And in the doc itself, you'll see a link to the Visto Facebook page, because every Friday at noon, I go live on the Visto Facebook page. We talk about the newest updates from the previous week and do a live Q&A there as well. So that's it on my end. Thanks everybody for listening. Again, wanted to keep it on the shorter end so we could get to questions. If you do want to connect, there's kind of 3 ways. Number 1, connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm more than happy to have more connections there. Just make sure you spell my last name right. josh@visto.ai is my email. Feel free to shoot me an email there. And in terms of websites, if you are an international student or a skilled worker interested in Canadian PR or a post-grad work permit, definitely check out visto.ai. It's a free portal, so you can log in for free, get access to a whole bunch of awesome immigration information and all that stuff there. I also have a personal kind of like passion project on the side called Solopreneur Grind, where I have a podcast interviewing other solopreneurs about their journeys building their own businesses. And I have a blog there as well if you want to check it out. So that's it for me, at least for the presentation portion. I'm going to grab this link right now and yeah, I'll throw it right in chat.
That's great. I put what looks like the link to your Facebook group in chat, maybe not your Facebook page. So
Awesome.
I'm not sure if that's the right one, the Express Entry community.
That's the Facebook group.
Yeah.
That's the private group for our members. Our Facebook page is where we go live. And I can send a link to, actually, where's the chat? There's the chat. When I enter this link to the special measures doc, it has a
Yep.
link to our Facebook group right in there. For some reason, I can't.
There you go. I found the Facebook page anyway. I posted it in there.
Oh, here's chat. Okay. Awesome. Enter. So that link in the webinar chat should take you to my the Google Doc with all the information.
Great. And we've got a couple of questions here when you're ready.
I am ready to rock. I can open up the chat tab as well, or the Q&A tab. Is that what you're referring to, Greg?
Yeah, I'm going to kind of read them to you or whatnot, just to make it easier.
Sure.
But feel free. Question. I am an international MBA student with study permit that expires in 2021. I want to start a corporation. One, can I do that?
That's a good question. I don't believe you can, right? Because when you're on a study permit, you're limited to 20 hours of work a week, generally part-time work. So number one, I don't even think that you can incorporate on a study permit. I know that you can on a post-grad work permit, so that would be after you graduate. Um, but I'm actually going to have to look into that. That's a good question. I've never heard of someone on a study permit looking to incorporate. Now, one way around that is at the very least, you could co-found a corporation with a Canadian citizen or a PR. But what I would be concerned about is that you're very limited in what you're allowed to do in terms of work on a study permit, right? So it's generally limited to 20 hours a week, and there are restrictions on that. So that's a really good question, Dinmu. What I can do is I can look into that further and get back to you. I just don't know if you're allowed on a study permit to form a corporation.
I'm going to send you the emails of everyone who registered so you can kind of send out links and stuff just in case people can't capture it in the chat room or whatnot. Um,
Perfect.
so, based on that, I guess he could be the CEO of his own corporation as long as he co founded somebody and he wasn't working for more than 20 hours a week.
Yeah. Well, if assuming so whenever you're eligible to incorporate, you're allowed to be the CEO. I just don't know if you're allowed to strictly on a study permit. At the very most, you would want to be very careful in how much you're actually working, right? In order to make sure you're abiding by the conditions on your study permit. So definitely check those out first. But it's an interesting question. I've actually never been asked that before. The ability of someone on a study permit to incorporate. So I can look into that and definitely get back to you.
And his question is, what does he need to do when his study permit expires? Is there an option for him to change it at expiry time to another type of permit?
Yeah, so and this is in the Visto portal as well too. We have a full guide to what's called the post-grad work permit. So in most situations, international students will graduate from a study permit to a post-grad work permit, which is an open work permit allowing you to work for any company as well as starting your own company. So you can be self-employed under the post-grad work permit, and then from there apply for permanent residency. So definitely check out the post-grad work permit. That's the most common route that international students are taking upon graduation.
Great. I've got a question that you're going to have to decode for me a little bit. Will the ER apply for work permit on behalf of the EE, or EEs have to do it themselves?
Will the ER apply for work permit on behalf of the EREs? Have to do. I'm not sure. Oh, employer and employee. Okay, so it's a good question. Different companies do it differently. So what happens is the company has to apply for the LM. If you need an LMIA, the company will have to apply for the LMIA. Then what happens is, technically speaking, the employee submits their work permit application, right? The work permit application is through the individual. However, what often happens, especially if the company that's sponsoring you is using a lawyer, is they'll pay a lawyer or a consultant or whoever to submit it on your behalf. The company itself cannot submit a work permit application. They could. I've never seen a company submit a work permit application for an employee. What I have seen is a company cover the cost of a paid representative to submit the application for the individual.
Great,
Hopefully that
thanks.
makes sense. And if it doesn't, feel free to expand on the question and I can go into more detail.
Yeah, definitely keep your questions coming. We have a few questions here about the startup visa program, and I know, this wasn't the topic of today, but is there any chance you can give us a little bit of a high level of that process?
Yeah, so to be honest, I haven't done too much startup visa work myself. We actually just posted a blog on the Vista website that I can pull up and link to because I have a friend in my network who did come through the startup visa. And so he wrote a guest blog post. I'll pull it up and I'll throw it in chat so that people can learn more about it. Basically, though, you need a team with an idea that for a company that is supported by a certain organization within Canada. So, for example, Mars, Invest Ottawa. There's all these like kind of startup organizations around the country. What you need is basically a letter of support from one of those organizations. And if you just Google Startup Visa Canada, you can bring up the list of, I believe what they're called are referral partners. But you do need, some semblance of an idea, an actual company with some form of support from one of those organizations in Canada. And actually, here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to post a link to one of our blog. This is actually one of our most recent blog posts. It was posted 2 weeks ago. It's called Immigrating to Canada, Express Entry versus the Startup Visa. So this is basically comparing permanent residency and whether it's better to come through Express Entry, which is the PR program that I kind of focus on for skilled workers, does not require a job, versus the Startup Visa. And so I just threw that in the chat as well.
Yeah, and I'll be bringing someone else on the next couple of weeks to talk about the startup visa. I'm just trying to negotiate the proper date. We're back and forth a few times, so we'll have a whole breakdown on that. So thank you very much. But as far as you know, the program is still available.
As far as I know, it's still available. I haven't actually looked into it in the last week or two. I would imagine that, especially if you're already located in Canada, that similar to other applications, they're still processing it. I think one of the problems you might run into is getting that approval letter, though, the letter of support. I don't know if those, the other organizations are still doing that and writing support letters. I'm not sure. You would have to go to those individual organizations to find out. But definitely look into it. I know it's a good option, especially if you don't have a high enough score through the program called Express Entry. And I can look into that as well. That would be a quick Google to find out whether the program's still open or not.
Yeah, and somebody mentioned here in the chat room that it looks like Toronto, but the official services is closed about startup visa. So I'm not sure what that means, whether the office that runs it happens to be closed during COVID or whether something's going on there.
Yeah, I mean, anything in person is going to be closed. So related to immigration, so you can't give your biometrics in Canada. There's no in-person landing appointments for PR approvals. There's no citizenship tests. All of that is being closed. So any of these processes that rely on like an in-person meeting or something like that, then they're not going to be running. I think you just muted
Sorry. Yeah,
yourself, Greg.
I know. I muted when I meant to unmute. I am, so I see we got another question here from Sai. I'm a foreign national currently on a closed work permit. Visa working in Toronto, which is valid until 2021 October. My wife filed my spouse PR on March 1st, 2020, but still we haven't received any email or acknowledgement from IRCC that my file is received, and so they're a little worried. Is there any advice for that? Any suggestion there?
Yeah, it's a good question. So spousal sponsorship is a long process, right? So on average, it takes about 12 months. It's also by mail, right? So it's slower than the online applications. I'm trying to remember. I've done two of them by mail, and it doesn't surprise me that you haven't heard in a month and a half. What I would recommend, Sai, is filling out a web form if you haven't already. And then I see the follow-up. Do you have any idea about the timeline and how many days it takes? Yeah, so I know that spousal sponsorships take on average about 12 months to process, right? So it is a slow process. And I'm not surprised to hear you haven't heard back. The other thing I've been telling people is like, expect like a 20 to 30 or 40% delay on regular processing times, right? So luckily, you're on a work permit valid until next October. So you should be fine getting the approval by then. But what I would recommend is maybe wait a couple more weeks. If you haven't heard anything, fill out the web form online. So just Google CIC web form and you fill in the information on your application and just ask for a confirmation that they've received it or not. You can't check your status online because it's a paper application. But filling out the web form, they should be able to confirm whether it's been received or not. The other thing to keep in mind is for all these paper applications, generally what happens is you send them in and then they sit in a pile for the first month or two, right? Because it's all just backlog, right? It doesn't actually take 12 months to process a spousal sponsorship. It takes, 6 months to sit in a pile and then 6 months to process it. So yeah, I recommend the web form, and I wouldn't be too concerned right now because it's very early on.
Sorry, I was muted again. So we have another question. I'm just about to point the list here, but someone was asking, can you I'm going to type in the list of designated organizations for startup for the startup visa. I have the link here, so I'm about to paste that in. Um,
Awesome.
do you know if there's because I see venture capitalists and other things on here, so it base an angel investor group, so an incubator. So that seems to be mostly the list there. We have another question here. How long does it take to get a conditional approval for the work permit for in Canada class?
Okay, so Andrea, I'm assuming you mean for the spousal sponsorship in Canada class, um, or are you referring to like a PNP program? Um, I'm going to assume spousal sponsorship in Canada class. Okay, got it. Um, yeah, I mean that's just kind of up to regular processing times from within Canada. So if you go on again, if you Google CIC, average processing times, you can select the type of application and where you're applying, and it'll give you the average. So it's really up to that. But again, I would add 20-30% to that because CIC has told us that we should expect delays on any applications coming in and not to rely on what they're posting online. So regularly, it takes, a couple months, 1, 2, maybe 3 months. I would double check on the average processing times, but expect delays.
Great. While we're waiting for it, somebody was asking if the LMA is waived.
If the LMIA requirement, if
Yeah, I don't know what that acronym means. So,
well, I'm assuming he means LMIA, but I'm just wondering. Okay, because so it's from FW who is asking about the employee and the employer. So he was saying, so the employee has to find a lawyer themselves. No, so it really depends on the situation. If the previous question, LMIA waived, how long? Um, I'm not sure what you mean. You can't really waive an LMIA. You can be exempt from an LMIA. So if you're applying for a work permit that is exempt from an LMIA, then um, then you don't need one. But okay, so I'm assuming you mean the employee has to find a lawyer themselves if you're LMIA exempt. Okay, I'm assuming that that's what we mean here. Okay, so either way, it's up
yes.
to your employer, right? I mean, technically speaking, the employee is filing their own work permit, right? We can call that the default. The employee is submitting their own work permit. There are then a few options. You can submit it yourself. You can have a paid representative submit your application, which means either you or the company can find and pay a lawyer to do it for you, or you can designate another individual to submit it on your behalf who is unpaid, right? So someone from the company could submit it on your behalf. You have to sign authorization saying, I authorize this individual to submit this application. They are not being paid by me. Only certain types of individuals can be paid representatives. So lawyers, immigration consultants, et cetera, et cetera. But it's really it's situational, right? Some companies are more than willing to pay to have a professional do it. Some companies are not.
I can do it myself. If so, how long is the processing time? Is it faster if you use someone else?
No, so who submits the application will not affect the processing times unless you don't submit it properly and it causes a delay, right? So in most cases, let's say for example, processing times of a work permit depends on what country you're applying from. So the best way to find that out, again, go on the Canadian immigration website or type in CIC average processing times, and you can select the type of application and the country you're applying from. Because the determining how long your work permit processing will take depends on what country you're applying from. Now, that being said, if you submit a work permit application and you don't submit the right documents, and the government then asks you to submit more documents, your processing will be delayed by a lot, right? So if you submit your application, or if you, for example, pay me to submit your application, in theory, they should be processed in the same amount of time. However, if you don't prepare it properly and there's a delay, or it causes a delay, it might, by extension, cause longer processing times. But assuming everyone prepared it properly, all things being equal, it should be processed in the same amount of time.
So
So
do they have to?
basically,
Yeah. Do they have to go back to the passport country to apply for it?
no, I mean, this really depends, right? So a lot of these questions are highly dependent on what we're talking about, right? Are you because you can submit a work permit application from within Canada, in most cases, and so it does matter in the sense that it affects processing times. So again, work permits while you're within Canada will be processed in a different amount of time than from your home country, whether it be any India, China. So what I mean by this is where you're located in when you submit your application affects the processing time. So the average processing time for a work permit application within Canada might be different from within China, from within India, from within Brazil, from within South Korea. They will each have their own processing times because it's the respective embassy that's processing them, right? So if you submit your work permit application from India, in most cases, depending on the type of work permit, it will be processed by the Indian embassy. If you submit it from within Canada, it will be processed by one of the visa centers in Canada, or not embassy in India, the visa processing center in India, the respective visa processing center. So as you can imagine, some are busier than others and some move quicker than others. So that's what affects the processing times.
Have you noticed? Have you noticed any difference from different countries in processing time that, since COVID? Like, is Mexico faster, slower? I've just picked Mexico as a random because I haven't been following the hotbeds of different countries and, our border policies. So have they changed from different countries right now?
Yeah, so I actually haven't been filing applications, Craig, for the last few months just because I've been on Visto, right? So on Visto, we don't actually file for you. We basically guide you through the whole process yourself. So I can't speak to the different countries during COVID. I can speak to the different countries pre-COVID, which is that, yes, there usually is a difference in the sense that some are, more on the ball than others, whereas um, how do I say this politely? Some countries are friendlier with Canada, right? Or some countries, Canada is, you know, the closer a country, the closer the ties are between countries, as you can imagine, the quicker or the fewer, they won't be looking in as much detail, right? So, for example, I've had some clients apply from certain countries where it just takes longer, right? Because the visa application centers are slower, or they're a little more skeptical because of the person's home country or travel history and stuff like that. So there's a whole whack of reasons why processing times may be affected, but generally speaking, um, they're pretty good at sticking to the average processing times overall.
Great. I'm waiting for a few more questions from the chat room here. I think we've answered all of the ones I could see. If you're looking for the referral organization, I post a link, Mars and whatnot. Those are the referral organizations from Government of Canada that allow you to, I guess, refer to get the startup visa. So
Yeah,
if you,
and I'll double check on starting a corporation on a study permit? I'm actually very curious myself now to know what the answer to that is.
Yeah, that's interesting. And with the startup and with the opposite, the startup visa, and I know we this is not necessarily what we talk about, and you're suggesting that you should go with the regular visa anyway because you have more flexibility long term. Do you know that if it matters, the type of company you're starting, whether it's a food company, AR company, tech company, do you know if the immigration process cares?
I don't think they care as much about the type of company. It's more about the support and validity of said company, right? And so I've experienced this too through the LMIA process. I've done plenty of LMIAs for companies. It's really less like they're industry agnostic, right? They don't really care about that. What's most important is it's legitimate company, good support in place. So in the sense of startup visa, they have the right support. This is legitimate. People are, they're going to be building this company that will create jobs, et cetera, et cetera. The LMIA route, again, totally industry agnostic. What they're most interested in is legitimate company, can afford to pay the temporary foreign worker. You're genuinely doing business in the country, and that you're going to continue growing and benefiting the Canadian labor force as well.
Great, and basically these are legit organizations who have a reputation to protect, so they wouldn't refer you unless you pass a certain level of criteria and whatnot. So, interesting way of doing it. We don't have
Mm-hmm.
any more questions coming up. So, do you have any parting advice before we say goodbye to our folks as to if they're applying for this process either as a business or as an individual?
Yeah, I guess just be careful, do your due diligence, right? Really, what immigration comes down to is finding the right information so that you can make the best decision for yourself. All right. Most of it is online. The problem with the information online and the IRCC website actually has a lot of really good content. It's just really poorly organized. So that's part of the reason why we started Visto, is especially around Express Entry, everything in one place in an order that makes sense. So do your due diligence. And the last little tip I'll say, and this comes up every week or two in my line of work, is do the due diligence and don't trust what a random person or friend or family member might say, because what happens in one person's case may not apply to yours, right? So what happens a lot is I get people say, hey, my friend's uncle told me that I have to do this. Should I do that? And I'm like, no, your friend's uncle clearly was submitting this application and that actually doesn't apply to you. So instead you should do that, right? So do your due diligence, rely on people who've been doing it for a little while, and rely on helpful people with that have done it before to hopefully steer you in the right direction.
Is there a list, any list for LMIA exempt organizations?
So whether you need an LMIA or not does not depend on your organization. It depends on the type of work permit. So there is a list of companies that are not allowed to get LMIAs because they have breached the obligations under them. So definitely stay away from those companies. What's most important is the type of work permit. So some work permits are LMIA exempt. So for example, the postgrad work permit, which is the open work permit for individuals who come to Canada, you study on a study permit and graduate. You can get an open work permit, does not require an LMIA. There are certain other exemptions to LMIAs, but it has nothing to do with the company. It has to do with the type of work permit. So yeah, that would be the answer to that.
And there was a question about the requirements for the startup visa, and I don't, unless you got them off the top of your head, I don't necessarily want to go into them. But basically, looking at this designated organization list, you have to basically go through their intake process and get your business assessed and all that kind of stuff. And that seems to get the letter support, and that seems to be the basic process. Then you take that letter and apply. Do you have anything to want to add to that?
I mean, the requirements, that's the biggest one, right? That's going to be the hardest part. So what I'll do is kind of relate that to getting a study permit. Applying for a study permit is actually very straightforward. The hardest part is getting the acceptance letter from the university. It's the exact same thing as the startup visa, where The process of applying is actually pretty straightforward, right? If you can think of immigration applications, it's filling out forms, copy of your passport, maybe work experience letters, getting a medical exam, That's kind of um, standard across the board, especially for PR. The hardest step is actually getting that letter of support. Just like for a study permit, usually the hardest part is getting the approval letter. The rest is kind of just going through the motions, and you can find all those basic requirements on the website. So even the link that Craig posted with the list of designated organizations, if you go to the bottom, it says top questions. It says, how can I qualify for the startup visa program? Just click that link and it'll tell you uh, everything you need to know pretty much.
Fabulous. Thank you again for taking your time today. If people want to find out more about you and what you do or reach out and contact you, where would they go?
Yeah, I mean, basically, so Greg, I'll send you my deck. Everywhere you can reach me is in the deck. You type in Josh Schachnow on LinkedIn, connect with me there. Definitely follow us on all the socials, visto.ai. My email is josh@visto.ai as well. So I'm pretty reachable by all those means.
Fantastic. Again, thank you for taking the time today and answering all our questions. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Greg. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate that too.